As we're talking together about the importance of understanding the future that God our Father has purposed for the generations of our time, I think very quickly we come to the realization that there's no way to figure that out through human reason. We really need revelation. So I was seeking the Lord on this, asking Him to help me, because I was realizing that with His revelation I could challenge, I could encourage, I could help the children, the young people I was involved with to really rise up into the destiny He had for them. But without it, I was just, so limited in how I could engage with God's purposes in their lives. And so as I was seeking the Lord, He began to challenge me to look at not only what is happening today, but other times in history when He had spoken to leaders of that time about their generations and helped them to overcome their challenges and to raise up chosen generations. So I began to consider that carefully. And He led me to a story in the Bible you might be familiar with. It's found in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 23. It's talking about parents. Parents that had evidently been seeking the Lord, asking Him this kind of question about their child. Because it says here, by faith, these parents hid their little baby boy for 3 months after he was born, because they saw he was not an ordinary child. God had shown them something about His plans for that little boy, the future He had for him. And then it goes on to say, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. What was happening here? Well, you know the story. Pharaoh, who did not know Joseph, was now being threatened by all these Hebrews. So his answer was to pass a law that said that all of the little Hebrew boys, 2 years and younger, had to be destroyed, to be thrown into the Nile River, fed to the crocodiles. And so we don't know the story of the other parents, but it was a horrible, horrible time. Now, when we look at that, we think, well, too bad. That's just what goes with human history. But as we look a little bit closer, we begin to realize something is happening here that we need to understand a little more deeply, because it's key to understanding our time. And as we look at it, we realize there's more than human confrontation here. There's something happening in the spirit realm. That in fact, from the very beginning, when Lucifer rebelled against God and the other angels joined him and were thrown down to the earth, there was a war that began and has continued until now. A conflict between the powers of darkness and those who honor the living God. Lucifer evidently has figured out two important things, as far as I can tell. One, that when God makes a promise, He keeps His promises. We talked about that earlier, that's something you can depend on, right? It's unshakable. Secondly, that God fulfills His promises, His will, through chosen leaders. Leaders that He sets apart, as we talked about earlier, in the womb, and then appoints and stays with until they're able to fulfill His purposes. And so the enemy works to try to destroy those chosen leaders, to discourage those who are trying to help them rise up into their destiny. Well, thank God for these parents. They didn't give in. They were not intimidated. They knew God, and they had come to grips with the fact God has chosen our son for something special. And so they sought the Lord, and God gave them answers as to how to save their son. God gave them the strategies to train him and raise him up. We say, now, Dale, how did Satan know that particular time there was a little Moses around? Well, let's look again at this matter of promises. If we go back to Genesis chapter 15 and verse 15, we find God making Abraham a very interesting promise. He says, listen, your descendants are going to go down into Egypt for 400 years. They're going to be slaves. And after that, I'm going to bring them back here to this place. Well, guess what time it was in Moses' time? 400 years had passed since that promise was made. Satan knew, God keeps his promises, and so he tried to destroy that generation. And the truth is, Satan was pretty smart. He was pretty discerning, because God had chosen Moses and that generation for two very important things, which you will probably recognize as well. What were they? The 10 Commandments, and also the establishing of the nation of Israel. Two very, very important things that happened. Did they happen? You bet you they did, because the parents, the leaders of that time, sought God and received understanding of the destiny that he had for them. They didn't stop there. They actually went beyond just saving him. As you read on in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 24 and on, you find that they were effective in helping Moses to discover who he was, to understand his values, and to really come to know God before he went into Pharaoh's court. What a challenge, but what an encouragement that in that time, in spite of all the difficulties they were facing, that God met them and enabled them to know and fulfill the destiny that he had for their generation. So what was the difference between the parents who threw their babies into the river and this set of parents who made a basket and saved their little boy and saw him rise up into amazing leadership? I believe many of the other parents believed in God as well. But sadly, they were just going along with what everybody else was doing. Talk about it and see how that compares with our situation today. Are we seeking God, really expecting him to speak to us? And if we're not, how can that become more a part of how we serve in our leadership, whether we're parents biologically or spiritually? And here's a question too. In our time, do you suppose that there is a parallel between Moses' time and today? And if so, how would you see there being some similarities between our times? Let's consider together again how we can be a part of challenging the generations of our time as we look back and learn and take our next steps with God. "1,500 years passes, and we come to another very important time in history. And here again, we find some parents who've been asking God what he has purposed for their little boy. And he answers their prayers by sending an angel to them in a dream. We read about it here in Matthew chapter 2, verse 13. And it says here, "And an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. 'Get up,' he said, 'take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him.'" Kill him? What's this? What is this about kings wanting to kill little children? As we look closer at this, we realize that similar to Moses and Pharaoh's time, here again is a leader who's fearing for his throne, but is vulnerable to the powers of darkness and their influence. And again, it seems that Satan was alerted that in that time, God was about to do something that he had promised, which Satan was trying to stop. Because you see, as we look back in the Bible, we find as early as Genesis that God promised that the seed of the woman would bruise the head of the serpent. And then again and again and again, he made promises about this Messiah, a Savior, a champion that would come to deliver people from their sins and from the powers of darkness. And so you can be pretty certain that Lucifer and the forces of darkness were very, very concerned about when that particular promised one would come. And so as the angels began to sing in the heavens, glory to God in the highest, and other things were happened, again, you can be sure that they were alerted to the fact this was the time that the feared one, the great one that God had promised, was actually coming. And so they moved on the heart of this king, and he gave the command to kill every little Hebrew boy 2 years and under in that area. Now, we don't know the story about the other little boys and what happened there, but we know what Joseph did. And in the next verses, Joseph does something that to me is really, really amazing. In fact, I'm going to have to confess something to you. If I had been Joseph, I'm not sure I would have done what we read about next. You see, lying next to me there in the little baby bed or whatever they had was a little 2-year-old. When you look at him, he looked like any little 2-year-old. He didn't have a halo around his head. There were no birds flying over him. He wasn't dressed in some little guru outfit. He was a real little boy. And when they looked at him, all they had that distinguished him from other little babies and little 2-year-olds were God's promises. And they had to take that by faith. And so for me, looking at a little 2-year-old next to me and having heard this from an angel, I would have been tempted to be what I would call practical. I would have thought, man, I need a good night's sleep if we're going to go to Egypt. And I would have slept. I wouldn't have forgotten what the angel said, but the next morning, I would have probably gone and arranged to transfer some money or gold or something, right? To Egypt so I could start a new carpenter's business there. I mean, after all, I'm supposed to look after my wife and my children, okay? I'm trying to be responsible here. And then thinking about the travel, through the desert, the Negev desert. I mean, bandits and shoot, it's dangerous. So I would have gone to the travel agency and arranged to go with a caravan. The only responsible thing that I could think of doing. And then, you know what? I'm from a little country town, and I'm not very familiar with other cultures. I definitely don't speak Egyptian. And so I probably would have signed up somewhere to take some course in Egyptian language and culture. Now, when I get to heaven, one of the first guys I'm going to look up and thank is going to be Joseph. You know what I'm going to say to him is, Joseph, thank you for getting up in the middle of the night and going to Egypt, because that's what it says he did in the next verses. We read on. Verse 14, it says, so he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. Radical? I mean, that was an amazing step of faith, a huge price that Joseph and Mary paid to save their little boy. But as you know, he was more than just a little boy. This little guy had a destiny. And his destiny, according to God's purpose, was that he would grow up. And this time, he would not just provide the law, which was important in Moses' time. This time, it would be a way of salvation for all people, to be saved from their sins for eternity. This time, through this chosen little boy, his destiny would be to start not just a nation, as Moses did, but a kingdom in the hearts of all people. Wow. It is important to understand what God has planned for the future of our children. And here's my question to you and me. Are we willing to be like most people who get a good night's sleep and, just do what everybody else does and hope that things turn out okay for our children and our young people? Or are we like Moses' parents and Jesus' parents, with great sincerity seeking God to know what he has for the generations of our time, and taking hold of what he promises us for them, and stepping out in faith so that together we can see them rise up and fulfill the destiny that He has for their lives. What a privilege, but also what a responsibility. As together we take a journey, take next steps in learning how we can bring the generations of our time into fulfilling their destiny in God.